Welcome to the Celebrating Women podcast, co-hosted by Mandee Montana and Ashley Fisher, a podcast that celebrates women, their issues, their thoughts, their lives, conversations that celebrate their gifts, their talents, their courage. It's the Celebrating Women podcast. Presented by Hand & Stone Massage and Facial Spa in Tyler, Texas. Hey, it's Mandee Montana. At Hand & Stone Massage and Facial Spa in Tyler, you can give your skin the essential hydration it craves by moisturizing the Hand & Stone way. Chelsea Everett, the lead esthetician at the Tyler, Texas location, says keeping the skin moisturized stimulates skin barrier functions, which is crucial to the health of the skin. Chelsea, I know you've got 3 key tips on how to best take care of your skin daily. Do you want to give me those now?
3 key things are keeping your skin moisturized, staying hydrated, and of course wearing sunscreen. Moisturizing and especially hydration go together so well. You have to have that moisture barrier to hold that hydration in. Otherwise you can drink gallons and gallons of water and it's just gonna evaporate right out of the skin. Also keeping the skin plump and slowing down the aging process a bit. But also, wearing sunscreen. UV exposure is responsible for 80% of early facial aging signs. So it's crucial not only for preventative aging, but for preventative skin cancer.
Chelsea, thank you so much for stopping by today. I just love your tips and I'm going to incorporate those into my daily routine. I so appreciate you stopping by today. And for all of our friends that are listening, remember you can stop by Hand & Stone Tyler in the Cumberland Shopping Center to make your appointment or online at handandstonetyler.com. Welcome back to the Celebrating Women podcast. I'm Mandee Montana with Kellie Ebenstein, and we're talking books. Welcome, Kellie.
Hey.
So we are in a hotel about halfway in between where we live in Texas. I think Kellie had to drive a little bit further. I'm east, she's west. We met in the middle so that we could be together, and it's a fun date. So when you listen to this, it's going to be quite a few weeks after we record, but today happens to be the full moon in Sagittarius, which I learned because I follow astrologers and, social media. So I found that to be entertaining, and Kellie thinks that I'm a total nerd, but that's okay. The reason I think that's entertaining is today's topic is Feyre Archeron, who is the main female character of A Court of Thorns and Roses, and Feyre is a Sagittarius. She was born on December 21st, which is like the final day of Sagittarius, and there's so much fun stuff that's wrapped around that, including the fact that Feyre is a hunter and she hunts with a bow and arrow, and the symbol for Sagittarius is a centaur with a bow and arrow. It's like the constellation. Okay, I'm getting too in the weeds. So, Kellie, why are we talking about Feyre?
If you could see my eyes rolling right now, because I told you last time that she gets into the weeds and goes into the details. So I'm going to try to keep us on track today. No, the whole point of this series is because we wanted to really highlight strong female characters in literature. And we both love Sarah J Maas. And one of the reasons why we love her is the fact that all of her series include a very strong female lead character, but then all of the minor characters that are female are also very strong, some in a positive way, some in a negative way, which we'll discuss as we go through this series. But the fact that all of the females that she writes about are very, very strong characters is what we wanted to highlight by starting with Sarah J Maas and her books.
For sure. And as we were kind of planning this episode, we came across a clip from the Today Show where Jenna Bush Hager was interviewing Sarah J Maas about the debut of A House of Flame and Shadow, which is in another series, her Crescent City series. But she was talking about the whole kind of universe and the characters, like Kellie was just describing, how so many of the women are fierce. In fact, Jenna Hager says she wants to call them badasses. And this is what Sarah had to say.
I've always been drawn to writing women that can't be placed in any definable category.
Yeah.
They can be very feminine, but then also go beat the out of the bad guy and save the world and then look good doing it.
So, it's amazing. Yes, her characters are fierce and they're saving the world. Oftentimes we see characters that are male doing that, but part of what we love about her books and her series is that the women do get to save the world. They have the weight of these worlds on their shoulders oftentimes, and we just find that incredibly inspiring and beautiful, and relatable in a way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as women, we like to identify with these strong characters to bring out the strength in ourselves. So, a lot of the reason why we love reading is because we see so many of these characteristics in ourselves. So let's get started with Feyre before we spend too much time on all this background stuff and run out of time on this episode. Feyre is a very, very, very strong character throughout this series.
Yes, and I do want to say, just before we go any further, major spoilers for A Court of Thorns and Roses series. If you haven't read it, if you're cool with spoilers, keep listening. If you don't want to have anything spoiled, you might want to come back to this after you finish the series. And it's possible we'll drop something about other books just randomly, so just a heads up on that. Most likely not, but definitely spoilers for A Court of Thorns and Roses. Feyre's childhood, Kellie.
Feyre's childhood. Okay, so one of the things that I really love as we were going through, how to talk about the strength of Feyre is how early and how young she was when we started seeing her strength. So in the beginning of the book, we learn that, she comes from a wealthy family, but her family ended up losing their fortune. But before that happened, her mom passed away when she was only 8 years old. And when her mom passed away, Feyre is the youngest of 3 sisters, and her mom made her promise that she would take care of her dad and her sisters. So her mom recognized her strength when she was only 8 years old. And then when her family lost their fortune at age 11, she's still trying to take care of them. And when she was 14, when they are completely out of money and were about to starve, she had to teach herself to hunt in order to bring home food for the family to keep them from starving. Her father wasn't doing anything. Her sisters refused to do anything that required any physical effort. So at 14 years old, she's carrying the weight of her family on her shoulders.
Right. And we meet Feyre at 19, but just to kind of flesh that out with you, Kellie, I mean, her family was really wealthy. Her dad was known as the Prince of Merchants. For her childhood, her father's father was the Prince of Merchants. And so they were used to vast wealth. And her mother she very much loved her father, was into planning parties and figuring out how to marry her children off, poured a lot of attention into that, not so much their education, which becomes important a little bit later in the book. And like you said, at 11, when the money runs out after the mom dies, he had racked up a lot of debt. And so creditors start calling. And when they come in, they maim him. They take all the money, they take the valuables, beat the heck out of her father. And Feyre is the one in there witnessing it while her sisters are hiding in the, in the bedroom. And then at 14, of course, she goes out and begins hunting. But this is a young woman who suddenly is taking the weight of her family on her shoulders. And
I think it's also important to emphasize that her mom died when she was 8. And because they thought they were too good for the local school, she and her sisters were pulled out of the local school, and her mother was the one responsible for teaching them. So her mother had been sick and then died when she was 8. So she never really finished educating Feyre. So Feyre didn't really know how to read. She knew her letters and very basic stuff, but she couldn't read.
Right.
And here she is carrying the weight of the whole family.
Right.
And that'll come back later on as an important plot point that she doesn't know how to read.
Right. And so when we find her, she's in the woods. She's hunting, and she sees a deer. She's going to kill it. Then she also sees this wolf. And she decides that even though this wolf seems over large and potentially we also know that Feyre is in a magical land. She says that this wolf could be a fairy, and fairies are not something that is delightful in this world. They are very scary to humans. They've been said to harm them. They're considered monstrous, right? And so she's like, do I kill it? Do I not kill it? She finally decides she's going to kill the deer. She's going to kill the wolf. She'll take the pelt and sell it to provide for her family. And that really is the catalyst for how the rest of the book moves forward.
Because since he is a fairy, there is a treaty that the fairies have with the humans that you can't kill a fairy unless it's provoked or whatever. And so when she does this, it invokes this treaty. The next character that we're going to learn is Tamlin, who is a fairy. and he comes in his animal form, in his monster form, to her family to find out who killed his friend, the fairy.
That's right. And when he shows up, he's like bursting through the door. If you could imagine like Beauty and the Beast, right? The animated classic, when Beast is just like raging at Belle. That's what the imagery that comes to mind whenever I'm reading this book. It is a Beauty and the Beast retelling in some form. Sarah J Maas pulls from a couple of other folklore things that she loves as well. And we could deep dive into that another time. But he is in his beast form. He's very scary. And what happens, the reactions of the family members, her father cowers because he's basically lost it since he was maimed. His strength of character is so weakened. Her two sisters are cowering, and Feyre just says, like, okay, yep, I killed it. And he's like, wait, a small human girl, you? She owns up to it. And when he's like, okay, it's a life for a life with the treaty, she says, well, take me outside before you kill me so my family doesn't have to see it.
So he gives her an option. Either I kill you or you have to come back and live with me in Prythian, which is the fairy land, the magical land. And so she goes back with him. And one of the things that we focus on with Feyre is she doesn't ever really put herself first. That's one of the things that's very strong about her, is her need to protect. So she's trying to protect her family through the whole first part of the book. Every decision she makes, it's all about protecting her family. So she shows, even though she's terrified of going with him, she goes because that's what she has to do to protect her family, and she's still trying to honor that promise she made to her mother.
At 8 years old. I mean, it's mind-blowing, but it's a vow, and it was on a deathbed, and so she really holds on to it, and she continues to hold on to it throughout her time in Prythian with Tamlin. So she travels to the Spring Court, and that in and of itself is terrifying for her. One of the things that we see also with Sarah J Maas's characters before we get into her time with Tamlin is these young adult females are very much in charge of themselves.
Very independent.
They're very independent. They own their sexuality. Consent is really important in these books. And there's not a prize on virginity in these books like there are in some fairy tales. And I just think it's really interesting and just a part of the way that Sarah J Maas shows these women and these female characters as equals in this world, in that they have choice in whenever they want to become a sexual being. Like that is their choice. That is their decision. It's not incumbent upon marriage or some kind of like contract with male characters. It's not because a father hands a woman off. She mentions that some in the human realm, but it's kind of almost dismissive, like it's not as important.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was also very important to Mandee and me when we were looking at this, as part of her strength and the strength of the characters she writes, is that ability to make those decisions yourself. This is not a male-centric world that she creates, and not in any of her books that we've noticed. That it's very much, women have choice over themselves, over their decisions, over their bodies. It's very refreshing because in so many stories like this, that's not the case. So anyway, she goes,
and it is her choice to go with Tamlin.
To go with Tamlin and to save her family. She was given a choice. Neither one of them were great. Go with me or die. However, she's the one that is making the choice to save her family. So she goes. And the whole time, she is with Tamlin in the beginning. She's doing, like, she's honoring the treaty, because that's what she has to do to protect her family, but she's constantly trying to find a loophole to get out of the treaty, because that promise she made to her mother is such a huge part of her character. Like that is shaped who she is, since that promise was made at such a young age, that everything she does in the beginning is trying to get back to her family, because she is worried so much about her family and them not being able to take care of themselves, that she's trying to find a way to get back to them.
So Tamlin tells her repeatedly that her family is cared for, but of course her context on fairies is that they're liars and
Can't be trusted.
And, you know, she doesn't know what that really means. She then later learns that he is actually caring for them in a great way. But throughout her time with him, she begins to face these other negative fairies that keep showing up, and
Very
she's trying,
dangerous.
very dangerous, and she's trying to find her way home, and she hears about this one dangerous fairy that answers questions, will answer any question, almost like there's an implied omniscience in this character. It's called the Surreal, and she learns about it from Tamlin's friend Lucian. And these are really the only two fairies, along with Alice, that's looking after her, that she interacts with in the Spring Court. She's kind of just got these three people that they're feeding her, they're clothing her, and they're her like link to this world as she's trying to figure it out. And she just keeps meeting these challenges with strength and courage and bravery. And when she finds out there's this Surreal that can answer her questions, she's like, will I be able to find a loophole in the treaty?
Well, and the thing is, you know, even though she's afraid of fairies, all she's ever heard is negative. She's afraid of them. She knows that the Surreal is a dangerous creature. She does not hesitate for a minute to as soon as she finds out how to find a Surreal and how to trap it, she immediately goes into action to try to trap this. Like, she's not even worried about her own safety because she's trying to get back to protect her family. So she's not worried about her own safety. She goes immediately to try to trap the Surreal, which is almost impossible. And everyone is surprised to hear that she trapped this Surreal because she's just a lowly human, but yet she goes out and through her own wit and skills and knowledge, she's able to trap this being that's been around for centuries. So she traps him and is starting to ask him questions about, you know, how to break this treaty, and finds out that she can't. But she also gains a lot of information from this fairy. However, in the process of that, some other bad guys called the Nagas, another bad fairy, start to come, you know, the Surreal hears them, starts coming. And again, she knows she's in danger. And instead of sacrificing the Surreal to save herself, her first response is to free the Surreal. Even though that could put her in even greater danger because it takes time. She, instead of running away, she stays to free the Surreal and puts herself in danger with these other fairies called the Nagas, which she kills one. So, I mean, she's constantly putting the needs of others above herself.
And then as Tamlin comes in and kind of saves the day, they start to form a friendship, and then that bond begins to deepen, and she forms more of a friendship with Lucian as well. And they start to kind of form like almost a little bit of a family. And as her feelings deepen for Tamlin, she starts to begin to feel some protective feelings about him too. Another adversary shows up, with puts a head on a spike and terrifies them all. And she learns some other difficult things that are going on in the world. She learns that there's a blight on the land. And so she starts to wonder, once she realizes, and she's starting to believe that Tamlin has cared for her family and honored that promise to her mother, that they are clothed, that they are well fed, that they have a roof over their head. She begins to believe him. She then starts to kind of have a desire to protect Tamlin and starts worrying about this blight. And he eventually sends her home.
Because he's worried about her and is trying to protect her. So he sends her home because he knows the danger. She doesn't really know what's going on. She's heard bits and pieces, but she doesn't really know the danger that Prithian, or the fairy realm, is in. So he falls in love with her, is trying to protect her, so he sends her home. She gets home and realizes for sure that he did honor his promises. All of the wealth and the stature has been restored to her family. He does what's called a glamour, to where they don't really know what happened and they don't really remember all that happened. They just know that all of a sudden they have all their wealth back. And the reason that they lost their wealth in the first place, miraculously, supposedly, the ships that her dad lost were found, and that's how they got their wealth back. So he did protect them. In fact, went over and above what she thought. She thought he was just making sure they had food, but he restored all of their wealth and stature and everything back to them. So when she gets back and realizes that her family is taken care of, and she realizes how much she loves Tamlin and that he is in danger, like we talked about in the beginning with Feyre, it's all about protecting those that she cares about. And it's always been about her family, but now her second family, which includes, her friendship with Lucien, this budding romantic relationship she has with Tamlin, that starts taking over, and she realizes now she needs to go back to protect Tamlin. She doesn't know what's going on, but she knows she's in love with him. Her family's taken care of, so now she wants to go back and be with him.
Yep. And she's told her family, like, if you see these signs, leave the fairy realm, get as far away from fairies as possible. She heads back to the spring court where she finds Alice that was looking after her previously, and she starts to explain to Feyre what has actually been going on. When Feyre first arrived at the spring court, she sees that, Lucien is wearing a fox mask and Tamlin is wearing a mask, and they can't come off. And the other fairies also, all of them in the spring court, they have these masks, and she's been told that it's like a curse and there's a blight on the land, but Alice spills the tea. She goes into detail and she explains about how this villain Amarantha was in love with Tamlin and she wanted him and yada yada. And anyway, the curse was going to last 50 years. And if a human woman that hated fairies kills a fairy and then learns to fall in love with a fairy, that the curse could be broken. Tamlin had 50 years to make this happen and was days away from it when he sent Feyre back to her family and trying to protect her. So Feyre's like, oh my goodness, I love this. I'm the key to breaking it. So she gets Alice to take her under the mountain where Tamlin is trapped with the rest of the courts of Prythian and these other high lords and characters under the reign of another strong female character, in this case a villain, Amarantha. And Feyre exhibits, it's just so mind-blowing to me that she's got the courage to do this. She can't read. She's a human, and yet she's willing to go into this unknown world where she knows all of these fairies are a great deal more powerful than she is. She knows they're dangerous because Tamlin's a high lord and has power, but he's trapped underneath her, and yet she walks knowingly into this.
So let's back up for a little bit. So Tamlin told her to break the curse, she has to fall in love with him, right? And days before the curse was, to be last forever, he falls in love with her, tells her that he loves her. She loves him, but doesn't say it. That's why he sends her home to protect her from what's going to happen with Amarantha. But so because she doesn't say it, the curse isn't broken.
Right.
And so when she goes back, she goes under the mountain and she's facing, she goes in, and guess what? There's another horrible, awful, mean, dangerous fairy called what's it called?
The adder?
The adder, yes, that grabs her as she's going under the mountain. And that's when things get really awful for her, because Amarantha is this horrible, horrible person. She is yet another strong character that we will talk about in the next episode. However, she decides that she makes a deal kind of with Feyre. She gives her a riddle. If you can solve this riddle, then everything will be great. The curse will be broken. But if and so Feyre kind of makes a deal with her that, if she doesn't solve the riddle, then she has to complete 3 trials. If she completes these 3 trials successfully, then the curse will be broken. So Feyre takes the deal, and these 3 trials that she has to do she doesn't know what they are ahead of time, but she knows it's the only way to not only free Tamlin, but all of his court from the curse that they're under. So once again, she doesn't think about the danger to herself. She doesn't think what could possibly be facing her. She agrees to the deal because she knows that's the only way to free them.
And she's locked in a cell for months. And once a month, she faces these trials, and they're just as horrific as you can imagine. The first one that she encounters involves this massive worm. It's the Midgard worm. And I'm a millennial. I don't know if you are, but if you've ever seen Tremors, imagine Tremors.
Yeah, that's exactly. I'm not even a millennial, and that's what I thought of.
If not, YouTube it. These things are awful. They're absolutely terrible. It's a massive worm with teeth and whatever. And she uses her skills, her hunting skills. She exhibits her cleverness, and she masks her scent because she realizes in the course of facing the worm that it's blind. And so she realizes if she, disguises herself in this mud and filth, that it won't be able to smell her. And then she realizes too that there are these shards of bone that if she leads it across this pit, it will fall and she'll be able to kill it. And so even though she's human and not Fae and she has no magic, she finds a way through this, and she starts to gain the attention of Amarantha's whore, Rhysand, and he begins to help her. He's the only one that bets on her to face the worm and to actually defeat it. I mean, all these fairies are betting against her that, on how quickly she will die. When she defeats it, Rhysand is the one that gains the riches, and then even though she's defeated it, she's managed to hurt herself in the process. And so because he has gained so much from her, he comes down to her cell, he heals her and makes a bargain with her.
Yeah, and no one expected her to pass the first trial. Yeah. So just her wit and her ability to stay calm under pressure is what allowed her to get through the first trial. The second trial is a little bit more difficult because we told you that this would come up again, her inability to read. Well, the second trial, she has to read something. So because she's gained this favor, I guess you would say, with Rhysand, he uses his magic to help her because she has to pick the answer to a riddle, but she has to be able to read the riddle to know which answer. There's 3 choices, and he uses his magic to send heat and pain to her hand for when she's about to pick the wrong answer, and no pain for the right answer. So he is able to help her pass the second trial, but she's still in pretty bad shape physically. She's starting to get a fever, like there's all these things, and he keeps coming because there's a whole month in between each trial, like Mandee said, and she's in this dungeon and she's not getting proper food. So she's getting weak physically. She's gotten sick. She's had a fever. Like there's all these things, and he keeps coming under there to help keep her mentally strong, but also physically strong.
Yes, he's feeding her, he's clothing her, and he starts taking her to these parties that are happening at night where she becomes the nightly entertainment, and he gives her fairy wine so that she won't remember it. And so he starts starting to play a vital role in her time under the mountain as she's facing these trials. And all this time, while that's happening, her glimpses of Tamlin happen at these parties and at her trials, and every time she sees him, he's just sitting stoically next to Amarantha's side with like a face of stone. Like she doesn't understand why he's not coming to free her or help her, or she's so in love with him she's come back. It's pretty confusing time.
Going through a lot to save his rear.
Yes, and then so she faces the first 2 trials. She comes to the third one, and there are these 3 fairies that are presented ahead of her. I think Amarantha gives her another opportunity to answer the riddle. She doesn't know it. And these 3 fairies are before her, and what Amarantha has Feyre do, this all started with her killing a fairy, that wolf, Andrus, that was part of the spring court. And so Amarantha charges her to kill more fairies. You did it once before. It shouldn't be hard for you to do it again. You say you're a fairy lover, but we know you're a fairy killer. So they remove the hood. She stabs a woman. She murders her.
And so once again, she's putting other people ahead of herself, because even though
it's killing her to murder these fairies,
killing her emotionally, she still puts the needs of the Tamlin and the rest of the court above her own mental health.
Pulls another hood. It's a young man, and he's just like praying, and she realizes she has to find the strength to do this, to move forward. She stabs him. Then we get to the third, and she's like, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I've done it twice before. I'm going to find a way to do it. And when the hood is removed, it's Tamlin.
And she realizes that she's going to have to kill the man she's in love with. And that's when she at first she realizes, oh my gosh, Amarantha has put me in this impossible situation. But because we've talked about her strength, like her mental strength, her emotional strength, her physical strength, like all of these things, she doesn't lose her cool. She's able to remember all of these bits and pieces of conversation that she's overheard throughout her time in Prythian with Tamlin, and she realizes that his heart is stone. Like, if she stabs him in the heart, it will not kill him. So even though, I mean, can you even imagine, even if you knew it wouldn't kill them, trying to stab the person that you love the most in the world, that you're in love with? But she has the strength, because she knows it's the only way to break the curse. She stabs Tamlin in the heart.
So when she does this, the other fairies that have all kind of begun rooting for her, because she's this human overcoming these incredible odds, are like, okay, it's time to free them from the curse. She did it. Well, then Amarantha explains that the bargain that she made with Feyre wasn't specific enough. So if she faced the trials, she would free them, but not immediately. The only way that the curse would be immediately freed is if Feyre answered the riddle correctly. And so, you know, they're calling for her freedom, and Amarantha's like, nope, instead, how about I just kill Feyre? So she hits her with, magic and tortures her and raises her up in the air and slams her body down and breaks her back. And as Feyre is like gurgling blood from her mouth, she realizes the answer to the riddle is love. And she says it aloud, and it's like Tamlin's eyes pop open and chaos ensues.
Yeah, because that's what immediately broke the curse on everybody, which we didn't mention this before, but part of the curse was that their magic, all of these people, all of their magic was suppressed. And even the High Lords, which Tamlin is a High Lord of the Spring Court, and the High Lords have more magic than anybody else, so they still had a little bit of magic, but their massive amounts of magic have been suppressed. The minute she said love, his full magic was restored in that moment, because that immediately broke the curse. So he attacks Amarantha, rips her throat out, she dies. But in the meantime, Feyre is laying there, and she's dying and then dies.
And then she's resurrected, because we're in a fantasy world.
Thank goodness.
So each of the High Lords have different powers. They each offer a kernel of their power up to Feyre. She's resurrected as High Fae. And that pretty much brings us to a conclusion of A Court of Thorns and Roses, the first book. But it's certainly not the conclusion of Feyre's journey, because she's reunited with Tamlin. She returns back to the Spring Court. And from there, the journey continues.
As we go into book 2, it's really important to go back and mention something that happened in book 1 that's going to be important to, Feyre's journey in book 2. Part of what happened when she was under the mountain and she was forming kind of this friendship with Rhys as he's helping her, is they made a bargain that if he helped her, then she would then go with him to the Night Court 1 week a month. Right. And so that's very important to the storyline as we go into book 2. So in book 2, our whole thing that we've been talking about is Feyre's strength and how strong she is, emotionally strong, physically strong, mentally strong. Like, she's demonstrated this from, earliest childhood. But the torture and the trauma and the mental, emotional, and physical abuse that she endured for those months. I think 3 months under the mountain have really taken a toll on her. So as we start book 2 and she goes back to the Spring Court with Tamlin, this is the weakest that we see her, because she is really struggling with depression, and she's not eating. She's, wakes up with these major nightmares every night, and she's throwing up and she's losing weight. And she's really struggling, but she doesn't have any way to discuss it, because even though she and Tamlin are together, they're both suffering in silence separately. Like, they're not talking to each other about what the other one is going through. And so so she's really isolated in her depression at this point. And, that it's a real struggle for her.
It should be a time of joy because she's getting married to the person that she overcame all the odds to be reunited with. But like Kellie was saying, she is isolated in her depression. She's also like a colt in a new body because she's now high fae. And so she's trying to figure out literally how to move through the world because she stumbles or she breaks things or she shuts a door, it slams it and shatters it because she's so strong. She doesn't know her own strength. She also doesn't know her own powers. And those are going to start kind of slowly coming out of her. And as she's kind of coming into her own, she's asking, Tamlin for help to talk through some of this. And he is so concerned with what's going to happen after the fall of Amarantha because there is trouble brewing from Hybern, which is where she came from, that he is so focused on that he's concerned with that. He's also just ready to marry Feyre. He proposes, they agree to get married, and he's looking towards the future, and his biggest concern is protecting Feyre when she's just kind of going along with it.
And it's not just, and as we kind of go through, it's not just he's trying to protect her. He's developing an obsession with her, and he's very possessive of her and obsessed with her and over the top trying to protect her. It's not just, I'm trying to protect this woman that I love. It is an obsessive, possessive type of protection that is smothering her.
It's almost like he's caged her.
Yes, and literally and physically, we'll see in a minute, but it is making the depression worse. I think she refers to it as she's drowning. She feels like she's drowning because he won't let her do anything. He won't train her on how to use her new powers. He will not let her out of the house because he is so worried about what will happen to her that he's just gone off the deep end. He's starting to become, we start to see the progression of his abusive personality emotionally, and then it turns to physically, and it's really difficult for her how to maneuver through, how to deal with this, how to deal with him and the way he's treating her and her own emotions. And, there is a situation where she's trying to explain to him how she's drowning, and he gets so angry that his power bursts out of him, which causes destruction in the room. The furniture explodes, like it just totally disintegrates the whole room around them. And as she's trying to protect herself, just this dome of air surrounds her to protect herself. And so, she's having to navigate how to protect herself.
Yes, and part of what helps her navigate through that process is this bargain that gets called in. So we mentioned that under the mountain, Rhysand was helping her heal, and he bargained with her to have 1 week a month at the night court. And he calls in this bargain as a result of Feyre being just at her wit's end. She's about to walk down the aisle to marry Tamlin, and she realizes this is not what she wants. She's silently crying out for help and for someone to save her. And down this magical bond of this bargain that they've created, Rhysand hears her, and he just magically shows up in the middle of their wedding ceremony and calls in the bargain and takes Feyre back to the night court. And it's the first kind of time we see Feyre with any fight to her in book 2, because we've mentioned how weakened she is and isolated she is, within her relationship with Tamlin. But when she gets to the night court, she is really angry that Rhys stole her away. And he's like, wait a minute, I'm pretty sure you were asking to be taken away. And she's just like, taken away from my wedding. And she even hurls a shoe at his head. And with her new face strength actually hits him, which is shocking because Rhysand is a High Lord as well and very strong. But, I think they both realize that somebody needs to teach her how to deal with these things. And he begins,
He's very concerned about her because she looks terrible because she's lost all this weight. Her physical appearance, like she's got dark circles under her eyes. She's the vibrant, strong, person that she used to be is no longer there. She doesn't speak up for herself. She doesn't she is just a shell. And so he purposely needles her and tries to irritate her and tries to make her angry for her to get her fight back.
Forces her to learn to read by writing things like, Rhysand is the most beautiful High Lord, Rhysand is the most powerful High Lord, and all these other fun things that I could get in the weeds about, but I won't.
It's also how he's helping her learn to read.
Yes, he helps her learn to read. And then, he sends her back after a week. And the first thing that happens when she goes back is Tamlin grills her on what happened at the night court. Tell us what it looks like.
He's so jealous.
He's so jealous. And the night court's really elusive. Like, they're pretty secretive. Not many people know what it looks like or what goes on there. And so Tamlin and Lucien are just, don't give her any time to settle in. They just immediately start hammering her with questions. And so she starts going back and forth over time, once a week for a week each month to spend time with Rhysand, and he's teaching her to read. And even during that time, he kind of wants to pull her in a little bit onto what's going on with Hybern. He's trying to figure out how much he can share with her versus how much she's going to tell Tamlin, because he knows that she needs to understand about this war that's about to happen with Hybern, and he feels like she could play a part in caring for the humans as this conflict begins. And it's the first time she's really pulled into any of those conversations because Tamlin excludes her from all of that.
You really see that Rhysand sees her as an equal, whereas Tamlin sees her as a possession. And that becomes very obvious because when she's with Rhysand, she's more herself and she eats and she engages. And then when she goes back to be with Tamlin, she kind of reverts back to this shell of a person. And so you really start to see the difference in her, when she's with Tamlin and when she's with Rhysand. Rhysand brings out the best in her. Tamlin brings out the worst in her. And, as she goes back and forth, Tamlin's possession of her and obsession with her increases to where he truly does. She tells him she needs to get out of the house, and he refuses to let her, and he uses his magic to lock her in the house, into their house, and she has a mental breakdown at that point, which causes all this magic to come out of her, and it engulfs her in this dome of fire that is, it's very scary to the people that are actually in the manor house that see this, because it is just this, she truly has this mental breakdown, and they realize that she is having a mental breakdown, and this is not good for her.
And Rhysand feels it through this bond that they have between them. So he knows that as a High Lord, he cannot come into the territory and take her out because that would violate some deep...
Because it wasn't his week.
Well, yes. And you don't take another High Lord's female. So instead, he sends in his third, who Feyre has met during her weeks visiting back and forth, his cousin Morrigan, who we call Mor. And Mor comes in and removes Feyre from the household, removes her from the spring court, hands her over to Rhys after she's across the border, and then they return to the night court and begin to have some conversations about Feyre's future and where she wants to reside, and whether or not she wants to return to the spring court and stay with Tamlin, or whether she wants to choose to become a part of the night court and an emissary to the human lands.
Part of the inner circle.
Yes, Rhysand's inner circle. He's got, and we'll touch on this in a later episode, but his second and his third are both female, and then he's got a couple of guys that are Illyrians, which we'll learn more about maybe in the future, but these guys that are, a general and his spy master in his army, and they form his inner circle, and so he pulls Feyre into that as an emissary to the human lands, because the humans are so tied up in this conflict as well with Prythian, because Hybern once had human slaves. And the reason they want Prythian back is so they can take those human slaves back underneath their control. That's a big piece of the conflict.
So while, we've talked about protecting others is a big part of who Feyre is. Like in the beginning, her whole focus was protecting her family. And then we shift to she's trying to protect Tamlin and the people of the Spring Court. And now she's realizing she has to learn to protect herself.
Yes.
That's kind of what she learned through the emotional abuse she went through only under the mountain and with Tamlin, is she's got to protect herself. So while she's a part of the inner circle, while she's a part of the night court, she learns how to protect herself physically, because Cassian, who is the general that Mandee talked about a minute ago, teaches her how to fight, like physically combat. And then Rhysand teaches her how to use her power, because when each of the High Lords has a different power. Some of it's fire, some of it's, mental magic, some of it, they all have a different kind of magic. And so when they gave her a kernel of their magic to resurrect her, she now has all of that. So she can shapeshift, she can use fire, she can use air, she can use all of these things. She can turn water to ice. Like there's all these things from all these High Lords that she has access to, but she doesn't know how to wield it. She doesn't know how to control it. So Rhys is teaching her how to protect herself using her magic.
And part of the ways that he does this, and we'll keep this short because I could go on for hours because I find Rhysand incredibly attractive, is he banters with her. He plays with her. He puts her in really challenging circumstances to pull the magic out of her, because oftentimes it requires like life or death circumstances initially for her to pull it out of herself. And then she begins to learn how to wield it. And truly, this process of her figuring out how to protect herself is really what the bulk of book 2 is about, alongside her budding romance and with Rhysand, because like Kellie said, he begins to bring out the best in her. He begins to show her how to pull from her personal power and step into that. And he treats her as an equal throughout. And it really is, it's my favorite book. It's beautiful how that unfolds. But this essence of Feyre, of her strength and her courage in overcoming adversity, it happens repeatedly in this book. There's various challenges. She has to face a weaver in the woods. She has to go on this journey to get a book from the summer court, and she learns how to wield some of her water magic there, in addition to being physically strong. And then as this conflict with Hybern is happening, they're like, well, maybe because Feyre is this culmination of power, maybe she can nullify the weapon that the king wants to use, this magical cauldron. Maybe Feyre's abilities will help to nullify it so this conflict doesn't even come to pass. And so really, the bulk of book 2 encapsulates all of that, plus a really interesting encounter with the Suriel again, right, Kellie?
Yeah, so she encounters the Suriel again, and because Rhys is injured, they're doing training and he's teaching her how to fly and all of these things, and there's all these people that are trying to take Rhys down because he's the most powerful High Lord. And so Hybern, they're trying to take him down, and so they have these arrows that they shoot at him that have poison in them that rips his wings up, makes him very sick, blah blah blah. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Tara's strength. But she knows she's got to save Rhys or he's going to die. So she goes to find the Suriel again because remember, this is the guy that can answer any question. So she goes to trap him again and to ask him how to save Rhys. And that's when she finds out that they're really mates.
Yes. And she shows some strength after that through her anger at Rhys for not being forthcoming with her, because turns out he's known for quite a while. That's another plot point for another episode, hopefully in the future. But she does show strength throughout this. She shows strength in finding the Suriel. She shows strength in coming back and saving Rhys, even though she's really angry with him for keeping this information from her. And she needs a minute after that. She goes off on her own for a little while. And then, she just keeps showing these moments of mental, emotional, and physical strength in addition to her magical powers. And when it all comes to a head at the end of the book, we find all of these characters facing each other once again. Instead of Amarantha this time, though, we have the King of Hybern, we have Tamlin, we have Lucien, We have Feyre in the inner circle with Rhysand, and a surprise visit from the two Archeron sisters.
Yes, because Tamlin, in his obsession with Feyre, has made a deal with the King of Hybern, who is our new villain. He's made a deal with the King of Hybern that he will side with him as long as he gets Feyre back. And so part of that deal is the two sisters, because the King of Hybern is trying to see if his cauldron works, and he's trying to prove it to the queens, which we will talk about that later. I know we keep saying that, but we're trying to focus on Feyre's strength, not everybody else's. And during that process, the King of Hybern puts Feyre's two sisters into the cauldron and turns them Fey, which neither one of them wanted to. It was totally against their will, and Feyre is furious that Tamlin sold them out. He sacrificed her two sisters in order to get her back. And even though she told him that she left on her own, he sold her sisters out. And we've talked about how much her family means to her and everything she did to protect her family, and then here he sold her sisters out and did something to them against their will, because they hated fairies, and that's the last thing they wanted, is to be turned Fae. And so she is very, 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 very angry. However, she realizes, okay, I got to switch gears here, because this is when she has to go back with Tamlin, and she realizes that she's got to put that anger to the side and play a part with Tamlin.
That's right. So the King of Hybern, part of what Tamlin wants is for this bond to be broken between Rhysand and Feyre. And so Tamlin asks for the King of Hybern to break the bond. He breaks the bargain between them, and Feyre pretends to have been under a glamour the entire time that she's been with Rhysand, and that she pretends that she does not love him, and that suddenly she sees Tamlin again for the first time, and she's so in love, and she's ready to go back to the spring court. She's devastated about her sisters, but she wants to return home with Tamlin and Lucien, and so she does, and in turn becomes a spy, and from the inside begins to unravel the spring court.
One of the things, we keep going back to her strength. Even though she's very angry at Tamlin, she uses extreme cunning to work all of these people to turn them against Tamlin, including Hybern's niece and nephew, who come into the picture, who are very, very strong fairies, very strong with mind magic, and she's able to take them out. And her strength, her mental strength, her physical strength, all of that comes into play here as she's turning this whole court against Tamlin, because not only of what he's done, but also we can't have him and his strength allied with the King of Hybern in this war, like Mandee said. So during this conflict with the niece and nephew, her power is compromised. So she has to use physical strength and emotional strength and mental strength to get out of the spring court, trying to make her way back to the night court and back to Rhysand. And she faces lots of enemies along the way. We won't get into the weeds of that. Just know that she's having to use all of her strength and all of her mental, physical, emotional capabilities, because her power is compromised. But she does eventually make it back to the night court and Rhys. And that's where her sisters are, because Rhys promised that he would take care of her sisters. And so she gets back. They're very angry that they've been turned Fae. So she's really having to use her, emotional strength to reconnect with her sisters and get beyond the anger that they have, because Nesta, one of the sisters, is just angry. Elaine, the other sister, is just withdrawn and devastated. And we'll get into more about Elaine in the next episode and what drives both her and Nesta, but it's on Feyre to bring everything back together.
And she does in the best way that she possibly can. And then we see her move forward with, as this emerging conflict is happening with Hybern, there's these 7 courts within Prythian. We've got like spring, summer, winter, autumn, day, dawn, and night. And they each have a High Lord. And that's who the king of Hybern is fighting against. All of these courts, but all of these courts are not always friendly with each other. In fact, there's been a fair amount of conflict since Under the Mountain. They were all under there together, and they faced trauma too. So Rhysand and Feyre call this meeting, well, Rhysand calls it, of all the High Lords and pulls them together. And at this meeting, we see Feyre step into a new role. We didn't know, but Feyre became High Lady of the Night Court, which is unheard of in Prythian. There are no High Ladies at this time, and none in current memory. So it's a new role where Rhysand is showing her as his equal, and they all know he is the most powerful High Lord in history. So for him to have Feyre here by his side as his equal is really surprising and
unheard of.
They managed to have some discussions, and during this time, she's exhibiting confidence. She's exhibiting her skills as a leader, her communication skills, her emotional intelligence, and the way that she communicates with the different High Lords, and they're all surprised by it. And then as some other things begin to happen and conflict arises, Feyre gets really upset, and then her powers actually come out, and the rest of the High Lords see for the first time that she actually has a piece of each of their powers and is learning how to wield them. And it's a pretty strong moment for her in that she doesn't cower from these 7 men, or 6 men, I guess, because Rhysand is alongside her. She just owns it, which I think is pretty badass.
That's when I feel like that's kind of the height of her character arc, because at this point she feels that she is an equal, and she doesn't take any kind of nonsense from any of these men throughout the rest of the series. Like, she owns her power from this point forward. So, like, we can talk about different aspects of, the rest of the plot of the story through the war with Hybern, and we end up winning, but that gets into the details. I feel like at this, to win, obviously she uses her physical strength, her mental strength, her emotional strength, her powers, like everything. She's come into her own at this point. She's always been strong, but now she has a level of confidence and she owns it now. So, I feel like anything we say beyond that is just going to be details of the story that we will get into in further episodes. And as we talk about other female characters in the next episode, I feel like we've reached the character arc of who she is and owning her power.
Well, and she's learned how to protect herself. And as this role of High Lady now, she has an understanding that as the leader and ruler of that court, she now has to protect her entire court. Yes. She also feels that she needs to protect the human realm. And so, yes, she embodies all of that, like you said, throughout the war and the coming plot points. So that kind of wraps up the 3rd book. And then as we go into the next book, Feyre's journey, we begin to take a shift, because in A Court of Thorns and Roses, A Court of Mist and Fury, and A Court of Wings and Ruin, the first 3 books, are all told from Feyre's point of view. We are inside Feyre's head. We are seeing the world through her eyes. We make a shift when we go into the novella, A Court of Frost and Starlight, where we hear from Feyre's point of view, but different chapters are told through different characters' points of view. So we get a little bit of her story continuing forward. And then in the most recent A Court of Thorns and Roses book, which is A Court of Silver Flames, we see Nesta's story featured. So as Kellie said, we sort of reached the ultimate point of Feyre's story. I feel like we should include her in our next episode, which this is a great segue into it. We can kind of continue Feyre's story into that. Our next episode, we want to feature the additional characters that Maas has placed throughout the series that are female and strong, and boy, are they abundant.
Absolutely, which I'm really excited to get into those, because some of those characters and their personalities are really kind of my favorite because they're so interesting, and getting into where they get their strength is going to be a lot of fun in the next episode.
So definitely come back for that. We'll probably be about a month from now, depending on when you're listening to this. I mean, you could be binge listening to this later, but if you're listening to this as it debuts, it'll be about a month before we get into that one. But we want to say thanks for listening, and we hope you're reading these and enjoying them as much as we are, because they're just truly inspirational, and they both have reminded us how to step into our own personal power.
The Celebrating Women podcast wants to hear from you. Email us a voice message to celebratingwomenpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear your story or the story of an incredible woman you know. Become part of the conversation on social media. Facebook.com/celebratingwomenpodcast. On Instagram, search Celebrating Women Podcast. The Celebrating Women podcast has been presented by Hand and Stone Massage and Facial Spa in Tyler, Texas. Book your appointment today. Stop by the spa in Cumberland Shopping Center or online at handandstonetyler.com. The Celebrating Women podcast is created and hosted by Mandee Montana and Ashley Fisher. Support the show for as little as $3 per month at celebratingwomenpodcast.buzzsprout.com or visit our show notes. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe to the Celebrating Women podcast.